Great, thank you very much, Noah. So we've got a panel discussion and Q&A now. So we've got some questions through. If anyone else wants to send through questions, that'd be great. So if everyone, I will stop the share. And if we could take off your, share your video. Hi guys, so great, thanks for that. We're only 20 minutes over, which I think is unsurprising. That was really interesting. I think there are a few things that we talked about exploring, and thanks a lot for a sort of pre-session we had where we got to discuss some things through. I think one of the things I'd like to go on to zoning early in this and have some discussion about zoning. And one of the things which I really wanted to just ask, because I think coming back to the COVID question at the start, we've seen a lot of change, we've seen a lot of change to behavior, and from data we've seen a shifting out of peak loads and actually a flattening of peak loads. A couple of questions in relation to that. We're also seeing a change in retail sector. So, is that going to be long term? Do you think that some of the transformation we've seen over the last year is long term? And will that have an impact on the distribution of heat loads geographically? And also, do you think that some of the changes in profile we've seen will be with us on a long term? Shivali, I saw you nodding there. Do you want to tackle this?
Yeah, I'll start. Thanks, Gareth. Some really interesting questions there. Agree with you on this whole pandemic situation has possibly changed the thinking and the way we use energy at the minute. The demand profiles for public sector buildings has changed, for other commercial buildings, industries. It's impacted quite a lot. But again, going back to zoning, I think it entails the identification of areas which can be readily connected to a low carbon heat network and mandating the connection, unless it is not cost effective to do so. Obviously, it's quite important to see that. But I think it's an interesting profile to watch possibly. And I think Caroline mentioned about flexibility. I think it goes in two ways. One is, yes, the DNOs significantly having some sort of a mechanism to incentivize, but flexibility in another way, that when we look at the methodology for zoning and making these heat network zones, we don't tie ourselves to situation or to heat demands now. Having that flexibility in the system that in 20 years hence as well, or even 3 years hence, we can adapt to the hybrid structure. So if I'm 3 days in the office this week and another 3 days, different days in the next week, the profile generally, aggregated profile will change, but the system has to be flexible. And I think it comes to another thing which you said about the optimization of networks is the controls, the BMS systems. That plays a big role, I would say. So it's, I hope I've given a little bit of thought on that question again.
Tanya.
Yeah, no, Shivali, totally agree, particularly with respect to the digitalization elements that we're hastily moving towards. But I'm wondering that the long-term impacts of the change in thermal demand that's resulted from a change in how we work and live. I mean, on the plus side, more diversification should be a good thing for designing heat networks, right? So it improves balancing opportunities. And then your point, Shivali, about tying that in with the local grid infrastructure, and can we be using that thermal storage to help offset peaks and troughs in the electricity system, potentially in combination with heat pumps. But then is there going to be sufficient heat demand of a size given the changes to, I mean, are we going to have sufficient heat demand as we are moving towards increased energy efficiency to justify the capital expenditure necessary, the upfront capital expenditure necessary to put those pipes in the ground in the first place? This is one of those conundrums that I think we're always struggling with. I would say yes, but others would say very strong no. So I'm kind of curious how we could wrap that in with all the uncertainty going on about what our future thermal demand profiles are going to look like. What do you guys think is going to be happening fundamentally to the way we design heat networks?
Phil, you.
I totally agree with what's been said. I think there is going to be a shift of a big change in the retail high street and away from large sort of shopping malls and that sort of thing. I think those will change in heat demand very considerably. I think we'll see a very different shape to domestic heating, because a lot more people are going to be working from home for those 2 days a week that you mentioned, Tanya. But I wanted to throw in the other big change, which is the rise of cooling. And cooling is heat. And actually, what are we going to do about that rise? And I'm spending quite a bit of time at the moment working on a project where we're sharing heating with cooling. One person's heat provides another person's cooling, and that prosuming is where we need to head to really reduce carbon. But it's tackling two problems: the heat decarbonisation, in inverted commas, but the coolth decarbonisation as well at the same time. And I'm not sure that traditional views of heat networks will address those two key problems.
Actually, Phil, can I pick up on 2 points there? I want to throw it back. I think there are two interesting things. So Shivali earlier mentioned mandating connection. And do you think we're actually going to oblige people? Are we going to get to the point where we oblige people to connect? And to make that work, my view is that zoning is only going to work if you do. But I do have some concerns that if we don't, and we're not hard enough on it, if you set the bar too low to, the cost of not joining, then everyone will find reasons. And again, come back picking on your point, Phil, about this sort of prosuming. We've seen often, we've seen new developments where you've got a supermarket within it, and they've got all this, effectively they're extracting heat out of the building to cool it, yeah. And they're not interested in connecting that portion through to the rest of the development as heat, because it's not part of their core business. How do you again get people to actually be incentivized to be part of that? Shivali, sorry.
Really good point there, Gareth. I know I want to say a couple of things on this. So I think it was touch based about the heat networks and penetration in the market from an awareness perspective. And I think it's quite important to say here that the sector's confidence growth will increase with regulation, but also with a higher demand assurance. In the end, for investors, is the double-digit growth as well, or the commercial IRR is equally important. Let's just face it. And mandating connections, either we do it centrally or locally, or we don't do it, whatever. It is clearly a mechanism for reducing the connection risk. Again, but that's increasing then the confidence of the sector to invest into the heat network as well. But it's important that we explore these granting powers to local authorities to mandate, because we can't look at heat now as a single vector. It's quite important to see a multi-vector approach. I think Tanya mentioned about the storage earlier. Then it's about the generation. We have already announced moving from 10 gigawatt hour to 40 gigawatt hour of wind generation. There are solar farms coming up. And then it's the big beast of electric vehicles. So it's important that we understand what is there in the local area planning for environment, infrastructure, and the place. And I agree, we will work with the local authorities to optimize the delivery of this and have the related interventions. But to answer this question, I think it's not entirely on its own. Can we just mandate this building? It's quite a multi-vector approach to be seen with local area planning. That's my view.
No, can we go Noah and then Caroline?
Yeah, and picking up on this, there's been some talk of mandating. I think it's not just about mandating, it goes along with incentives as well. So it's both carrot and stick that we need to look at to see how to make the transition, because decarbonising heat will come at a cost. And therefore, it does open up a question as, how do we share that cost and who should be paying? So I don't think it's as simple as saying, thou shalt connect, full stop, and you've got to take all the costs, because we don't think all the costs should be borne by the end consumer. And relating to zoning as well, and this element of choice, I think there's a question. It's not just about heat networks. It just so happens that delivering heat networks is the most complex of the heat solutions, and therefore, if you can crack heat networks, then actually it will help for the hydrogen where that's appropriate, or heat pumps. So we're not saying, you know, we should put heat networks everywhere. We should put heat networks where there is the density of demand, but we just need that certainty to say, right, this area is for heat networks, that's individual heat pumps, this area might work for hydrogen, for example.
Caroline.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on actually the comments that have been said. I think, firstly, I think it's really important when we are having this discussion to think about the impact of zoning will probably be quite different between domestic buildings and non-domestic. I think it's far more reasonable to talk about obligation to connect for non-domestics than it is perhaps for domestic buildings, or it's a more difficult, more complex discussion, I think, which is the first thing I just want to say. I think secondly, as well, I think just as Noah was saying, the question of how you shift the current market for gas boiler refurb in the UK is something that is not just unique to heat networks, and getting boiler refurbishment off the table, whether it's then a connection to heat networks, whether it's heat pumps at an individual scale, you know, whether eventually it's hydrogen, I think is something that we're going to need to crack alongside of putting in further support and incentives for connecting to heat networks in the right areas.
Actually, Caroline, I wanted to extend on from that because you actually put it in your slide earlier, this question around the level playing field between heat networks and other utilities, and in particular, if we start going through and making investments into, for example, hydrogen and to gas networks, is this all just kicking the can down the road in terms of keeping those assets working? And then by doing that, are we then actually frustrating, you know, potentially putting a block to the development of heat networks? Should we, you know, how do we make sure that it is a level playing field?
That's a really hard question. I guess all I would say to it, I think where we are at is that I think when you look at industrial decarbonisation, I think it's really important that we keep hydrogen on the table as an option. I think we have, say, for example, in our membership in the AD, we have big energy intensives where hydrogen may be one of the most reasonable ways for them to decarbonise. And I think so that needs to be part of the picture. I guess, perhaps on a personal level, I think there's a real question that we need to be getting into quickly about our appetite for stranded assets in the next decade or so, and who bears the risk for that. I think if I'm being perhaps a little blunt, I think the government's current position where we want really fast progress towards electrification of heat at an individual level, the massive growth in heat networks in the kind of next decade in the 2020s, whilst keeping our options open for the kind of repurposing of the gas network for hydrogen, I'm not sure is entirely compatible when you get into the detail of this. And I think we do need to make some decisions now in terms of shifting the balance to support heat electrification, and perhaps accept that you know, that creates some risk, and we need some appetite for that in terms of eventually the relative contributions of these different pathways.
Tanya, you want to come in?
Yes, thanks. I mean, around the zoning thing, I mean, Scotland's been moving along with their heat and energy efficiency strategy work, which is essentially looking at whether it's suitable to be setting up zoning, not just looking at heat elements, so whether the provision of individual or communal heat pumps and heat networks, but also looking at what energy efficiency improvements need to be made, because I don't think we can really we can't really maximize the value that heat networks bring unless we are also implementing energy efficiency alongside that, both to help reduce to help manage the diversification of profiles, but just as importantly, it's to be able to introduce both new developments and existing developments onto the same heat network infrastructure, building heat networks so that they are designed to only deliver to, for example, new developments and cannot accommodate existing developments, because those existing developments have completely different temperature requirements, for one. That is not a sound strategy for future proofing. So looking at heat networks in isolation in terms of both the commercial case and the stranded assets element that Caroline was coming in on, unless we are looking at the energy efficiency improvements needed to retrofit existing buildings alongside the business case for heat networks. I think we're exposing ourselves to a higher risk of stranded assets in the future. So yeah, kudos to Scottish Government for doing the local heat and energy efficiency strategy work up front. It's something in terms of, if we're really going to be seriously looking at zoning in England and Wales as well, it's something we should be really pushing for, that integrated approach to energy efficiency and thermal networks. And then just finally, that multi-vector approach that Shivali mentioned, and the cooling, so thermal energy being heating and cooling. You know, you need that energy efficiency element if you want to be combining the existing buildings, having those take advantage of that cooling. Because I can tell you, August, you know, I'm going to not be in my flat in August in London this year. I think I almost died of heat stroke last summer working from home during the peak of the summer season with no cooling available. You know, our buildings just are not built for the summers that we're getting these days. And you need both the energy efficiency element and the thermal network element to address that.
Tanya, I'm going to make a jump now. Sorry, everyone. But there's one element that you talked about just there, which is interconnection. And I want to pick up on a couple of different aspects of that. One, we're seeing lots of different networks in areas. So a lot of the time we talk about large-scale heat networks. But I'm a little bit worried, and I know, sorry, Caroline, I put my hand on this in the ADE all the time, say, remember that actually most of the heat networks aren't these big, massive developments historically. Most heat networks are being built at a development level or even retrofitted at a development level. And longer term, we're looking to interconnections of those. And I think there are a few things we need to go into there. One, should we be being a lot stronger in terms of stipulating certain temperature regimes in when we come back to zoning, because I get quite concerned that we have these different buildings being built near each other on heat networks running at very different temperatures. There is one element of that. The other is, are we going to get interconnection? How? Because we keep on talking about this, keep on talking about district heating ready, you know, that's in London Plan, but we don't see a lot of examples of people actually going and interconnecting afterwards, these schemes. How are we going to make that happen? So if I could just start with those two, if I could. Anyone want to tackle that? Phil, you put up your hand earlier.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was going back to heat zones, but I'll try and answer what is a very difficult question. So I've been frustrated by that for probably the last 5 years at least, if not longer, that these communal blocks have been going up, the Canary Wharf blocks, as I call them, without the real ability to interconnect. But what it comes down to is there's not that much incentive to interconnect. But I'm sorry to go harp on about the project that I'm working on at the moment, but actually, if you connect a data center to 5 Canary Wharf blocks, the data center can heat those 5 Canary Wharf blocks. And that's exactly what we're doing in a 5th generation scheme in Islington called Green Skies. Look it up. But actually, it's that sort of integration that might allow or provide the incentive to put the pipes in to connect it all together. Otherwise, it's not going to work. There's no incentive. Gas is too cheap. End of. RHI, the loss of RHI and gas being too cheap. If that playing field is not leveled up, then actually we are always really going to struggle because heat generally is too cheap. Why would you want to interconnect? My answer is interconnect at a low temperature so that you can recover data center heat or ventilation tunnel heat.
No?
Yeah, and building on that, yeah, completely resonate. Heat is way too cheap at the moment. That's definitely an issue which brings challenges. And we talked about not having incentives. And I think part of the challenge about interconnecting the existing networks is how can we bring in points of intervention when, for example, new planning applications are going in, replacement of existing boiler kit, as an example, for housing developments. when it comes time to change the heating system. And so having those points simply where you have to consider either upgrading your system or lowering the temperatures or connecting into a heat network, those things are currently not there. There's no education for a customer, building owner, homeowner on those kind of things. So I think there's an opportunity as this kind of the overall market framework to bring in that education, bringing those points where intervention can happen. And again, touching on Phil's point of incentives, currently, as I see it, the costs have to be borne by the ESCO or the end customer to connect, to do these interconnections, and then it just doesn't stack up, and then we're sort of caught in that vicious circle. So again, it comes back into how are we funding the cost, because it seems that we're not quite tackling that head on.
Shivali, that seems like a good point to come to you.
Yeah, I was just going to expand to Noah. I agree. Being an engineer, I agree the importance of the low temperature network and moving from high temp to low temp for more futuristic thinking. But parallelly, I think we need to recognize I have to be very careful here. We have to recognize what is our supply chain at the minute. Going to low temperature, and I think we see it in our houses as well. The moving from a boiler to heat pump in a very small scale, if you are seeing a direct impact on the emitters. Take it in a bigger scale for heat network, where you've got mixed technologies, almost bespoke for every project. You might have waste coming from an energy from waste plant or from a mined water heat pump. You might be looking more for radiators. And in the cases of ambient loops, you're looking for underflow heating. And I'm just trying to emphasize that we need to parallelly think about the skills and supply chain in the industry before we go on full-on mandation and making it, as a really something to follow on from now on, sort of a thing. So it's a slow burner. And I think Caroline mentioned before about the stranded assets. It's a stepwise approach, and reinforcing what Daniel said about the energy efficiency. That will, I think, automatically leave us to low temperatures networks as well. There is a slow transition, but I think the awareness and the whole industry working together, from consultants to clients to consumers, it will happen. I believe, Gareth, as you said, the change needs to happen, and I think it will happen with all of us working together.
Couple of things. So I'm going to make a jump in topic now. I note it's coming up for 11. If it's okay, we're going to extend by, because we ran over by 20 minutes, we're going to extend by 15 minutes. Is that okay for everyone in the group? Okay. Just want to flag that. I'd like to move on to standards and quality now. CP1 2020 is great because it actually sets minimum requirements, and numerically you have objective targets within it. And we heard from Mariota earlier about the need for assurance, and this general shift towards compliance is part of what we need to achieve. Effectively, we need heat networks to work well. We need to lift the bottom up in the market in order to protect customers. A question back, because we're going to have heat network assurance as part of the market framework coming through 2022. Is there a risk that we get backlash from the industry with this just being seen as adding an additional cost? What are the views here on that? Mariota?
I'd like to sort of, even just look at this concept of, the status quo, and our concept of being comfortable with being comfortable and taking a long-term view. Often, with these sorts of decisions, they're driven by, numbers rather than sort of long-term vision. And I think this is the challenge for industry leaders. Culture drives decision-making. And so whether or not you view this as a cost, or whether or not you view this as a long-term investment, because the goal is, as an industry, to grow from 2% to 20% or to even go greater. So, I think that's the big challenge is, if there is backlash, I think the challenge back to the industry is to say, where's your leadership? Where is your culture of moving beyond, just viewing this as a cost? And I think that's a challenge to reflect back to industry.
Phil?
Gareth, good design shouldn't cost more. My view is follow CP1. All you're doing is good design, and all we're doing is raising the bottom, as you said, of poor design into good design, it shouldn't cost any more, and procedurally, it shouldn't cost more. There may be a bit of a learning curve on the first couple that you do, but actually after that, it should be just sort of day to day, and actually not costing any more, but saving lots of carbon. So I think it's almost a misnomer that we are going to regulate ourselves out of business, as it were. And I do go back to what Noah was saying, that and it was only in heat zones, but actually it's sticks and carrots, and those sticks and carrots have got to be nicely balanced. That is the next big challenge, is sort of finding that balance within the new regulatory framework. But Noah also said something really important, which is, let's get on with it. And no disrespect to BEIS, no, I'm trying to help and support them, love them. But I think it's for the industry to get on with it now in the spirit that Noah was suggesting.
So how do we make sure that it just doesn't become, because we've seen so often when certification comes in, it becomes a drive to the bottom, a rubber stamping exercise, people drop cost and don't, how do we make sure that doesn't happen here?
Well, nobody else is pitching in, so I'll try again. So my view of CP1 is, look, we had a go at it in 2015, but with the view that in a few years' time we'll up the ante, and then turn the screw up more, and then turn up, and that is the process. That is the long journey we are on, and actually that will raise standards on a every 3 to 5 year basis, such that and it is a long time, but maybe 10 years, we're actually all really doing fantastic design that would have been seen as unattainable previously.
No, you?
Yeah, and I've worked in sort of the design side in previous times, and I think having the guide, even if it's to say, you should consider these things and you should do a checklist at these design stages, I think that would be immensely useful, because the sense I get, for at least on the side of the design, is that different people, some people are doing too little in the design, some people are doing too much, and then people are spending a lot of time is wasted actually, when actually if we can have the regulations that say these are the key things that you need to consider, that's actually very helpful. Will actually cut down in the time of the design. And on the point of the costs as well, will this cost more for the industry? Actually, I think it's people don't see the time that's lost going back and forth with designs in the design process, in the adoption process, when people say, oh, I'm not adopting that asset, it's not according to standards, it needs to be made right. All that time that's lost is not captured as well. I think it's worth raising.
Tanya.
Yeah, well, going back to your original point there, Gareth, about what it might be more costly to introduce compliance, I'd challenge that from the viewpoint of, are you talking about lifetime cost of the network there, or are you just thinking about the upfront costs? Because I think it's only the upfront costs that might increase, as Phil's saying, there's a learning curve involved, but lifetime costs of delivering a heat network, of operating a heat network, I mean, that should definitely be decreasing because it's based on better design, right? And I think that ties in also with the point Caroline made about a level playing field. Why should the heat network industry be the only one exempt from compliance? Pretty much every other industry, every other sector in the UK is governed by compliance. Why would we be the only exception? That doesn't make any sense either, does it?
I think you're going to be unsurprised to hear that I deeply agree with you. And in fact, unfortunately, half of our business at FairHeat is going and dealing with problem sites. So half our business is new build, going through assurance side. The other half is going and trying to deal with these train wrecks after they've happened. And in almost every case, they're avoidable. And the cost of something going wrong is way, way higher than actually going through and getting things right from the start, and the impact on customers. And I don't think we have time to go through. I was going to ask about how do we avoid the Grenfell type situation, because I'm really concerned with the end of the day, when these sites go wrong and when schemes go wrong, who ends up paying? Who ends up? It's generally the end consumer, the end resident, who's left with that, and they can be trapped in with these very costly. We've got schemes that we're dealing with only 2-3 years old, where all the pipework's having to be replaced because no one dealt with water quality from the outset. So I think it's really, really important that we put these checks and balances in. I want to leap on to skills gap. Tanya, you mentioned diversity as an issue. You mentioned trying to get grads in an issue. How are we going to encourage bright young things into our industry?
Explain how incredibly sexy it is to work in the heat network segment, I think, is a good start. I mean, we might not be as cool as the other sectors, but that's because we are smoking hot, right? So I think the branding wise would go a long way. I mean, also because, again, coming back to heat is such an underrated thing. Thermal comfort in your home is the thing you notice when it's not there. If it's there, if it's functioning appropriately, nobody ever thinks about it. And it just needs to, be low cost, needs to be there. And it's such a huge life improving factor. And if it's not there, it's damaging in all kinds of ways. It's damaging to health and well-being of citizens, to their ability to concentrate, to their ability to sleep. It's damaging to our healthcare system because you've got more people sick, taking up beds in NHS. It's damaging to the buildings themselves because we're reducing the longevity because they have moisture problems. I mean, it's technically speaking, it's a win-win situation to be focusing on thermal comfort, but I don't think we're good enough at branding how important thermal comfort is, how integral it is to the health, the well-being, both the physical and mental health and well-being of all of us around. I think actually COVID in that sense gives us a great platform for stepping out and really highlighting how important the sector is as a whole, because everybody's been stuck at home for so long, have really been noticing how drafty their windows are. So the energy efficiency element, how much they're paying for their heating because they have to have their heating on all the time during the winter. People have been noticing these things more. So there is more of an awakening interest that we could be riding the back of. But I honestly think it's branding. I mean, we don't have the superstar. You look at like renewable electricity. You've got pictures of windmills and solar panels. You look at you Google pictures of electric vehicles. You've got beautiful Tesla. You Google pictures of heat networks. And what do you think we get? We just don't have the same kind of brand awareness. I think that brand awareness, I think that would go a huge step. And also just to tie in with that, all the graduates that we have, all the young people who come and work within SWECO and the heat network side, and I'm assuming this is also the case for you at FairHeat with all the graduates that you have, they're coming to the thermal energy side and the heat networks in particular because of the climate emergency, and they recognize the impact that heat networks can have in terms of decarbonizing our heat segment, and they also are intrigued by the complexities and the challenges presented by decarbonizing heat. So in that sense, really using this year where we've got COP26 happening in Glasgow, individually as organizations, but hopefully also, to echo Shivali's words earlier, that we should all be coming together as an industry and helping each other out here, not just in terms of addressing the issue, but getting the right people, the right talent into our industry to help us rise to the challenge is kind of key, especially this year, I'd say. Great.
Shivali, you want to come in?
Yeah. Gareth, first of all, I would like to congratulate and thank you as well. In just last year, I think you've expanded your team to nearly double, or you've added 1/3.
Yeah, added half,
yeah. Just seeing from the faces as well, it looked like a very young team. And so I think you've already made a good progress. And it's many organizations we heard last year, because we did a lot of stakeholder engagement for COVID and for other things as well. We see apprenticeships going on like really actively in the industry as well. I think the need has been identified. And again, thanks to Tanya for your skills research, which you put on LinkedIn as well, and everybody could access it. I think it's now inevitable. And online virtual courses, I think it's become so easy now to access them, and people are taking that step to make some of them free as well, which is helping in this. I agree with you, Gareth, it probably needs to be fast-tracked a bit. I think it'll happen slowly. Now, I'll give you an example of one project really quickly in Durham. At CHAM, you might have heard about the project from Tolerant Construction So they're developing this heat network. I think it's around £4 million investment from HNIP. But I think the project has £175 million. But one thing which really caught my eye was they're having a talent academy, which they're looking to establish, and that will have young people, apprenticeships, around 960 jobs from that. So I think these are the numbers we need to start looking at, that what's happening, and maybe then give it more PR. And as Tanya said, Tanya, you were quite right. A couple of years back when I was looking at European images, when you Google heat networks and European image comes up, and there was like big incinerator with caterpillar face on it. I'm like, God, yeah, that's the best. So we can definitely do more PR together.
So I'm going to take the last couple of questions, then I think we need to get into others. Phil?
A quick one. There are no career paths. There are just no courses, no career paths. So if somebody did feel that heat networks and pictures of trenching were sexy, where would they go? Where would they take their spade to dig trenches, to put pipes in and stuff? It's just not there. And I'm working with London South Bank University. I work at London South Bank University. We're going to develop some courses around district heating.
No.
Yeah, just briefly on this point, I think it's really important. I think I want to bring another angle to it, which is which links into the certainty. If we know that these are the kind of technologies we're going to do, and we're going to do heat networks in these areas, it allows us, coming from an ESCO perspective, to invest ahead of need. We know that these areas are going to need heat networks. Therefore, let's get more apprenticeships in. Let's work more with the universities and get people and work with developing the local supply chain as well. So having that certainty allows us to invest ahead of need. But in this place of uncertainty where we're not sure if where the policy is going to go, it makes that bit more difficult. So we're really keen, and having that supportive framework will help, I think, as well with the skills gap.
I think we need to leap on to some questions from the floor very quickly. One thing I will note on that, we have almost exclusively hired in, I think we brought in 17 chemical engineers over the last few years. And one of the big differences we note here is that heat networks aren't part of the core curriculum, chemical engineering degrees, whereas you go across to Denmark and they are part of the core curriculum. And I think we need to, come back to your point, Phil, actually make sure that they're starting to be included. But we got over 300 applicants this year for 4 posts. So I think there is starting to be that sort of interest there. Question from Dave Lancaster. An interesting measure in one of the graphs shows that knowledge of heat networks is not increased. Why does the panel feel that knowledge is not increasing with the obvious benefits of the systems? Tanya.
Well, actually, what I wanted to comment on there, I thought that was a great question. I saw it. Now, I am sitting in Denmark at the moment, and in Denmark, you've got almost 70% of all residential homes their heating demands are met through district heating. Most of my family has no idea what district heating is, and they have no idea whether or not their home is connected to a district heating network, and they couldn't care less either. I mean, they're absolutely. And whenever I remind them that this is what I do for business, they're like, yeah, that's nice, right? So there's absolutely no care whatsoever. People only care about things like this when they break down. So my challenge, I guess, around those numbers, which was from the ETI the analysis that was done, where I think it's crucial that we have knowledge of heat networks, is around that client base, in order to and of course within the heat network industry itself, but clients who are scoping out heat networks. So this is within the property sectors and within public sector. Those people who are scoping out the need for heat and energy efficiency measures in the homes that they are affiliated with, whether they're existing or new build, that's where we need the knowledge of the heat network sector. In the general population, I would challenge that is even a requirement. It'd be nice if students were aware of it, but I think that might be better addressed through the courses that Phil was mentioning, and you yourself as well, Gareth. But for the wider populace, I really don't think that there is a need for them to understand what heat networks are.
One thing I do think is there is an increase. I think we are increasing knowledge and experience in the industry. I think we're doing it rapidly. I think CP1 2020 is a good illustration of that. I do think, though, we tend to be a little bit siloed and people keep things to their chest. I think we need to be far more collaborative as an industry, far more about sharing best practice, because there is no way we're going to hit those targets if we don't. And I think it's actually, I think the more we can share will actually help grow the overall industry. So I think we are actually growing, But I think we need to be doing more on that front.
Yeah, and I think just to say on that, I think I totally agree, but I think it's really important, I think, when you're looking especially at heat across to energy efficiency, to think about the different occupancy tenures and what you'll be able to do with different ones. I think if we're looking, say, owner occupied and using, as Noah was saying, trigger points in terms of, I guess, the sale of a property, for example, perhaps in future conditions associated with your mortgages, which is what we're seeing in energy efficiency. I think I'd say that I think that's the only part of the market where actually raising that awareness is really, really important. I think sort of private sector social housing, I think you're exactly right, but I think that bit we still need to crack a little bit.
But again, coming back to trumpeting information out there, another question we've got coming through, question from Nigel Lane, is there a good practice guide for a heat supply agreement for the customer? And who wants to take this? Because I'm aware there is a suite of legal documents which has been paid for by government. There isn't awareness. Shivali, do you want to mention on that, or Caroline?
I can quickly mention, and then Caroline can go into details as well as a user. There are lots of, so Triple Point are our delivery partner with HNIP, and there's a lot of investment being done in standardization on contracts and how these can be used. That there's legal views on this one. So please visit the website. I can actually add some of them on the chat. Try to look at it. And yes, you're right, Gareth, there is a lot of information in there, but yes, it needs to be trolled down into consumers and customers.
Another one, where a housing association will be delivering a number of heat networks in coming years that will be handed over and operated and maintained by our asset management colleagues. What do you suggest we do now to prepare our internal teams and manage risk associated with the skills gap for operation and maintenance of these heat networks? Anyone want to deal with this, or? Noah? Yep, you're on mute.
Yeah, so I think, it's definitely a big challenge with housing associations, especially with the need to decarbonise their portfolio. I think our approach as Vattenfall is to work with a sort of partnership approach. So being able to understand what the needs are, because there may be a need for a lot of work with energy efficiency and upgrading the system. And so, I think the first thing is understanding what needs to happen there and understanding how that can work, whether it's a case of having people who are more specialists in the heat networks to work with that system, or whether that's building the capacity in-house. So one of our approaches is to say we don't have a kind of a model which says this is how you do it. I think we'd have to have that conversation to understand, okay, where are you in your journey? Where is your starting point really? And then take it from there, because that really ties into working to build supply chain. We're very happy to invest in supply chain, and we work with contractors as an approach to delivering heat networks. So I think having that conversation is where we'd normally start on these things.
If I can just on that, I'll take, we work with a lot of different heat, with a lot of different housing associations around this. I think the thing I would do is put a group together internally. So you see people like Guinness Partnership have done really well with this, where I would pull together the disparate parts of the business and make sure you sit down. You actually should set this up as an initiative around heat networks. You should consider right from day one, how do we want to procure heat networks? Look at CP1, which are the pieces how are we going to implement it? Look at our processes and build that through, and then actually be very, very clear on making sure that you get your specification written correctly that's going through, and that you have the right checks as you go through the process. And really importantly, I would treat your asset management team as being client internally and get them involved. And this is where we see this disconnect quite often. We have the development side and the asset management side who work independently, and the asset management side should be there from day one as part of that, setting the specification and make sure that you have your monthly meetings where you sit down and review it as a team. Sorry, Tanya.
Yeah, well, just to echo, I guess, one of your key points there, Gareth, around the CP1, the CIPSI will be hosting the new courses around CP1 2020, I've been told, starting this year. I'm looking forward to it, but that might be a good starting point, especially with the checklists that Gareth was referencing. Oh, sorry, Phil was referencing to in his presentation earlier, because personally I like having checklists. That would be maybe the economist / me, or the one that got attracted to working in an engineering consultancy in the first place, having a nice long checklist, so that you're sure that you covered everything. So not the negative connotation of it being a checklist exercise, but it's nice that it gives you a comprehensive overview of what kind of key risks you should be looking at, because I know from an asset management point of view, what you're really concerned about are those kind of long-term risks in terms of operation, maintenance, breaking down, reliance, etc. And having that initial list to know what you're looking for, know what you should be asking about. To me, that gives greater certainty of mind. Sorry, my English is failing me now. I'm hungry.
On that, I think we'll sort of wrap up now. There were quite a few questions we had back on domestic hot water and temperatures. I'm not going to do a spoiler. We have a presentation on that by Andrew McKay, and I'm joining him this afternoon. So please make sure you go along, so you'll get your answers on 50 degrees and implications around that to anyone's asked questions. Just one final question from Stephen Edwards. The GLA are pushing back on ambient loop systems, which do indicate the high levels of carbon reduction on scheme designs because of their commitment. Because their commitment to low to heat networks. Can low temperature ambient loop systems ever be having a role in integrating with and contributing to heat networks? And Phil, I think you're going to leap straight in on this one.
Yes, is the answer. Absolutely, and we're doing it. And can I just say, the system we're working on right now is actually all on existing buildings, producing 75 flow to meet the needs of those existing buildings. So it's not a new build thing. I think it's the way forward. And we're seeing huge carbon savings. I mean, unimaginable carbon savings for a heat network. And as I say, the more prosuming you do, the better. It's all about that sharing of heat and cool.
Can I think there's a little bit of a misnomer as well when people talk about ambient loop and different. I think where we're talking about it and when we see sort of the 5th generation that Phil's really talking about generally, we're talking about large scale ambient loop systems where you then get your endpoint. Often the buildings themselves, and this is where the difference is, and you get a number of people within the sector. You can have large scale heat pumps in the basement where you're then actually distributing at a step up temperature within the building itself. And I think the pushback from GLA isn't on the ambient system per se, it's actually integrating, but it is on actually distributing through and having individual pumps in every home, where I think that push comes from. And you can have 5th generation and 4th generation. This is where we'll have the discussions and arguments, Phil. I actually think it was a mistake to say 5th generation because it implies that it's a step on from 4th generation. I think 4th generation and 5th generation work very, very well together in systems together. And if you look around the world, that's actually how it's generally applied, where it's been applied.
Well, we're doing something new.
Shivali.
Really good comment on that one, Gareth. I'm mindful of time. I agree with you on it's a compatibility question more than any other pushback. I would say it's important that, again, coming back to the whole thing of awareness and education, how do we ensure that it is quite clear in the market? And this is this point which Noah mentioned previously. It's from the industry as well. How easy is it to actually connect these two from 4G, 5G? One is, we say from our technical CP1 guidance, and yes, Phil, Martin, and others have put together it, but it's also the practical use cases or any practical work or projects which have been done, and more PR on that one. And let's make it more flashy for more awareness on this. So I think evidence is going to play a big part in bringing the change as well.
Great. I think we have well and truly run over time. Thank you for your patience, everyone, on the course. Thanks for being here today. Really appreciate it. I thought it was a really interesting discussion.